Well, hello, adolescent culture class. Checking in here with lecture number 2. A couple things before we get into some content, just some general class things I wanted to mention to you. Um, One is, it's not too early to be thinking about that project that comes at the end of the term, the cultural exegesis project. You don't need to know about the details of that yet because that's going to come up later. But I just want you to be thinking about uh, maybe some ideas about a topic of interest for you to study, uh, or to try and get some idea of what some concern or something in the world of adolescent culture that you are interested in. So as we read and study, there's going to be lots of different things that come up. Some are really current, some are been around a long time. But I just want you to be thinking about like what might be a topic of that you want to study that in particular pertains to the people where you live, teenagers around you. And I want you to be thinking not too broadly. Like it'd be easy to say, well, I really want to study the topic of like identity formation. It'd be like, okay, well, 100,000 pages later, you're barely getting started on that. So too broad of a topic. But within that, you might find yourself going, I want to study gender identity in what's happening in that today. So, and you want to get narrow, but not so narrow that you can't really have enough to study either. You don't want your project to be too short. So, for example, TikTok is a big thing lately. That would probably be a good topic in essence, generally. But like the game that's really big right now, which is the Skull Breaker game, uh, on TikTok would probably not be enough to really study that particular phenomenon of that game. Maybe it would be, but I would think it might be kind of a little too narrow probably on that one. But the broader thing of the media platform might be worth studying. So just you don't have to know a lot about this yet. Just start thinking as you're reading what grabs you about a topic, particularly one you don't know much about and you want to learn more about, because this affects teenagers, either in your own family or your church or whatever. So something to kind of be thinking about. Also, in terms of course requirements, the discussions. A couple people have written me about what to post on the discussions because it's not really your whole reading response. That's those are great, but you don't have to post that whole thing. But I think just an idea for other people to respond to something you learned, something you're puzzled about, or whatever. I have found that in these online courses, the class discussions have been where people learn the most. They're so they're so helpful to each other, and I want to see the same thing in this class where thoughts from you guys to each other really become very very helpful and interesting. So that's kind of the goal on the discussions. Learn from each other. That's what's going on there. All right, so let's talk about course content a little bit. The book you just started reading, the Walt Mueller book, "Engaging the Soul of Youth Culture." You'll notice reading it. It's like it's not a new book. It's been out for 15 years or so, 14 I think it is. And so there's some things that because culture changes so fast that sometimes cultural references that Walt makes are things that you go like, wow, that seems pretty old. Well, I believe this is a book that, even though he's written newer ones than this, I think this one has great foundational concepts and ideas that are still valid and worth talking about. So, as you're reading that, just keep in mind that it's like look for the deeper principles and foundational kinds of ideas, as opposed to cultural references necessarily being the most important. But there's some great things, like in that first chapter, he talks about the idea about listening. He says to, of course, Generation Y or Millennials, which is who we're listening to, but also Gen Z, right? Because uh, Generation Z is mainly students born from about 1997 on. So our middle schoolers are born in Gen Z now. But there's a lot of things that are common to Gen Z. Same with millennials. Um, and he talks a lot about listening and trying to be pay attention to what kids think. This is hard for us to do, isn't it? Just as humans. I remember a time in our own house a few years ago when my oldest daughter was in high school, and she and her mom had a disagreement about something, and it was in the kitchen. I was sitting at the table, and they kind of hit these buttons with each other that the anger started to grow, as I was listening, I realized they were actually arguing the same point, but they sounded like they were disagreeing. But they actually thought the same thing, and I had to finally stop and say, "Are you listening to yourselves? Like, you're actually not arguing about anything that you're disagreeing on, right? But they hit those buttons, and then the frustration starts to grow. And we do this not just as parents, but as youth workers, just as human beings, sometimes with each other. And we have to really work hard to listen. I had a dad years ago who had 4 daughters. He was a lawyer in my church, and I said, He had great. All 4 of his daughters were wonderful adults. They grown up. And I said, Bruce, what was the key? You think? And he thought for a little bit. He said, I just learned to listen a lot. I thought, pretty good, simple advice, but not a bad thing to do, and hard to do. I remember as a youth worker with high school students one time, I made the comment. We were doing small groups, and I said, I want to hear what you guys think. So we're not going to judge what you think. Just tell us what you think. And so when I opened that up, then right away, of course, some new kid that I didn't really know, but had this whacked out bizarre idea about something that I couldn't believe he was saying. And so I didn't even realize I was doing this, but I quickly became defensive about, the church or God or the Bible or something. And I'd ask this kid to say what he thinks. And I didn't let him do it because I didn't really want to listen. I wanted to, listen to what I wanted to hear instead of being more careful about that. So I think Walt's ideas about listening is a great thing. We see this in that article you read this week in Growing Young, where the idea of just dialogue between us and kids, hear what they're thinking and listen rather than being judgmental. Pretty great thing to do, and seems so obvious. Yeah, listen to kids, right? But who does that? Most adults don't listen to kids, to adolescents. They just don't, right? Because they ultimately don't really care or think they know anything worth hearing. And youth workers, that's what we got to do. We got to learn how to listen well. I love chapter 5. We're going to get to the other chapters later in a week or two, but the chapter 5 one, I love his intro because he talks about going to college in the same state he grew up in, because he grew up in the Philly area, and then he went to Pittsburgh area, and it was like a completely different world for him, night and day. And it just kind of cracks me up how you wouldn't think in the same state it would be that different, but it is. My family, we moved here from Colorado Springs in '99, and there was a lot of things we loved about Pennsylvania right off the bat, but boy, the cultural adjustments, even the kind of thing where, like, my kids would complain because their new friends at school would say, "You're from where?" And they would say Colorado, and then their friends would say, "You can't even pronounce that right. It's supposed to be Colorado." And my daughters would say, "No, it's Colorado. I came from there. I know how they pronounce it." And people would say, "No, you're pronouncing it wrong." Even the state we came from, we couldn't agree on, and that's what happens in culture sometimes. It's like really hard to understand other people's setting and what's different than the one we're from or we're in now, and yet really important. So I think it's a great chapter just to be thinking about, that shift and how those culture things could be so difficult. But again, as youth workers, this is what we're trying to figure out how to deal with them. All right, so let's move on to another little topic here. Let's get talking about who kids are, what they're like, and what they're about today. About 15 years ago, there was a couple of folks who did a gigantic study and produced a book called Soul Searching. It was a national study of youth and religion, and a very impactful book because they looked at thousands of kids around the country to say, what are the real religious values of teenagers in America, including the ones who are part of a faith community. And very interesting and very like I said, influential response to this book. And they came up with this interesting term or little phrase called MTD, moral therapeutic deism. And they said this defines what we think teenagers really believe. And you might have heard that before, MTD, moral therapeutic deism. In one book I have, let me read you a couple thoughts what this really is. And this one from Kenda Dean at Princeton Seminary says this. These are, she quotes them as 5 elements about MTD. 1, teenagers, they believe a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. So they're okay with the idea of an existence of a God. Number two, that what God wants is for people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. Okay, so we read those things. We study with teenagers ideas about what Jesus said and Paul about how to treat people. Okay, they get that. The third element of this MTD was the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Now that one's kind of interesting because that's not necessarily a Christian central idea, is it? But that's what students were telling them in this study was the central goal of life: to be happy, feel good about yourself. I think about how we see this in like virtually every Disney movie, a lot of which are great movies. But often Disney movies are kind of focused on the idea of like, feel good about yourself. You believe in yourself, and you can do anything, and all this. Then it's about your own fulfillment. Used to be that I think there would be a lot more movies and stories about someone who would sacrifice for someone else as opposed to believing in myself. But I think that's something that's probably true about teenagers. Again, this is 15 years ago they were studying this. The fourth element of MTD was this: God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. So, students, and adults do this too, obviously, but students, when they're thinking about what's God's role in my life, well, it doesn't have much of a role. They don't really need God until there's a problem to be solved. And then it's like, okay, now I go and find out how God can help me with this, because that's part of why God exists, is to help me solve problems. So that was the fourth thing. And then number five was, good people go to heaven when they die. So along with number one, where they believe in, that there is a God that exists, they also believe that, if you're good and treat people fairly, like in number two, that, you'll get rewarded by spending eternity with God in heaven. So, there's fine elements of this. It's not that negative, but it's not really a Christian view. And I think a lot of youth workers responded to this study by saying, like, yeah, wow, this is what my kids think, but we've missed the boat a little bit on this. Now, in the last 15 years, as we've talked about all this, there's folks that don't think that really the MTD thing expresses, the picture of that completely at this point. The other two books that we're going to be reading in this class, which you haven't had to read quite yet, I don't think. One is Chap Clark's Hurt book, which was written about 15 years ago as well, and then updated with Hurt 2.0. That's actually the version you will have. And then next week we'll show or sometime in the future, I'll show a little clip of Chap updating 2.0, really in a way to say what's the 3.0 version of this. And in Chap's book, because Chap Clark, he's a former area director of Young Life and Young Life leader, still actually works with Young Life, pastors a church now in Southern California, but has also been a high-ranking academic at Fuller Seminary for many years. And Chap took a year of sabbatical, because that's what, I don't know if you're familiar with sabbaticals, but academics, take sabbaticals once in a while, and it's generally not to like recoup or rest or something, but it's to study something. And so Chap took his year, and he hung out with his high school students for a year, and then he wrote the book Hurt, because what he discovered was he felt like that students had this kind of world beneath, he describes it, right, that adults are unaware of, and that really adults have abandoned them to this world. So the word abandonment is pretty big for Chap about where kids are at, and what he found a lot was the kids seemed kind of lonely and on their own, and disconnected. Now the book Blur, that we're also going to be looking at by Jeff Kais, in Blur, he's a little more open to saying, there's nuances. Let's not peg every kid with like MTD or even how Chap describes it. He takes issue with those a little bit, to say, we need to be a little more fair to the culture today and see the broad sense of what kind of people our students are, and that maybe they're a little more religious, and we don't really grasp that exactly. So he comes up with a term about being kids being sacredly mobile adolescents. So ones who are maybe have lots of different varieties of what they think and believe, but really they are sacred in terms of they are believers in some way, but they're also mobile. They're all over the place, and they're hard to pin down, but that maybe we need to be a little more accepting of the breadth of this in terms of what these kids are like. So, what are kids like today, and what are kids like in your context? I think one of these themes that is going to find its way threading through a lot of what we read and study and look at in media will be this idea about students being lonely and disconnected and depressed and uh, you know, social media you think would connect them, but actually turns out to be something that keeps them on their own and individualized. And so um, we're going to see this a little bit in the article next week about Billie Eilish and her music. That there's a reason why it's big with teenagers. Her music is that it captures an angst that they feel and they understand. Um, and I'm kind of curious, as you look at this, you always want to be studying your own context, because what are kids in your community, church, family, uh, school, whatever, what are they like? Are they experiencing that kind of angst? Are they kind of on their own? Because, we often see kids around in different settings that we think are doing great. In fact, in Chap Clark's book, you'll find that he talks about how a lot of adults he talks about his book with it will say, "Well, I think kids are doing fabulous." Well, a lot of kids are doing fabulous. There's a lot of kids doing great, but he says underneath that surface, there's a lot of issues going on. But so, what is that true about the ones in your context? That's ultimately what you want to be able to study is who are these kids that I work with. Now, part of this lecture is there's a couple video links I'm going to post below the lecture. 'Cause I don't think I can put it in the lecture. I don't know how to do that at this point, but there are a couple videos, and they're both from shows where people are trying to perform and become famous. American Idol and The Voice, and I'm choosing these two to look at because the first one is the American Idol one from just a couple weeks ago. A girl who auditioning, and the clip is called "Just Sam." And part of what's so interesting is if you've watched American Idol over the years, you know that the show has gone from where they just lambasted contestants no matter what to really now they're actually in this clip, Luke and Katie and Lionel are actually treating this 20-year-old in a way that is not a bad model for a youth worker. And it's really kind of powerful and I think kind of a cool clip. But I want you to look at it partly to think, like, if you were an adult in this girl's life, how would you respond to her? How would you love and care for her on a day-to-day basis? And are there other kids like her with that kind of family background and the kind of setting where it's created some of the disconnect and loneliness for her? The other clip is actually from The Voice, and it was from fall of 19. And I've only watched The Voice one time. I've seen American Idol many times, but The Voice just once. And it happened to be the night when there was these two twins, identical twins, with a very unique story. And it's kind of surprising and in some ways jarring, or maybe for some of you in the class, not jarring at all. It might be like this is great. I found it interesting trying to think if I was the youth pastor or the youth director or youth worker of these two siblings in my group, and they revealed their story, how would I respond? Would I be judgmental, critical? Would I care for them? Or I love them? How would I deal with other adults that didn't like the story? What would be the tenor of your response? And so I want you to watch that and think about how would you respond to this? How would you do what Mueller suggests in chapter 1? How would you listen, and how would you love?